Baku, 1908. A city steeped in the smell of oil and gunpowder, a boiling cauldron of workers' protests, gang warfare, and underground revolutionary activity. It was here, in this chaos, that Stalin and Ordzhonikidze's acquaintance grew into something more. Together, they organized strikes, fled from the security police, and shared their last piece of bread. It was a time when loyalty to a comrade was valued above one's own life. Their joint activities did not go unnoticed by the authorities. Arrests, prisons, and exile became an integral part of their biographies. The culmination of this period was their joint exile to the Turuhansk region, a harsh, almost deserted place where only the most resilient survived. Winter lasted 8 to 9 months, and the frost froze not only the ground, but also, it seemed, their very souls. In a small hut dug into the ground, cut off from the rest of the world, they spent long polar nights talking. It was there, far from party disputes, that the foundation of their future relationship was laid. They were not just comrades in arms, they became a support for each other. Sergo, with his boundless energy and straightforwardness, and Koba, secretive and calculating, but who saw in Ordzhonikidze a person he could trust. This exile became a real test of strength for them. They hunted, fished, read, and argued about the future of Russia together. This common struggle for survival created a special bond between them that could not be broken by distance or subsequent political storms. They learned to understand each other without words, to sense each other's moods, and anticipate each other's reactions. When the February Revolution of 1917 broke out, they returned together to Petrograd, ready to build a new world. And in this new world, their friendship forged in Siberia became the key to their rapid rise up the career ladder. After victory in the Civil War and the consolidation of Bolshevik power, the country faced the daunting task of industrialization. It needed people capable of rebuilding industry from the ruins and creating entire industries from scratch. And Stalin, who by that time had already concentrated enormous power in his hands, knew who he could rely on. In 1930, Sergo Ordzhonikidze was appointed to one of the most responsible posts in the state. He headed the Supreme Council of National Economy, and 2 years later, in 1932, he became the first People's Commissar of Heavy Industry of the USSR. This was not just an appointment, but a sign of absolute trust. The People's Commissariat for Heavy Industry was a veritable empire within the state, controlling virtually the entire industry of the country: metallurgy, machine building, and defense plants. Its work determined whether the Soviet Union would be able to transform itself from an agrarian country into a powerful industrial power. Ordzhonikidze threw himself into his work. His energy seemed inexhaustible. He personally visited the largest construction sites and factories: Magnitogorsk, Kuznetsk-Stroy, Dneproges. He did not sit in his Moscow office, but delved into every detail, solved problems on the spot, and could easily go down into a mine or stand by a blast furnace. His leadership style was tough and demanding, but at the same time he knew how to inspire people with his belief in the common cause. Workers and engineers respected him for his straightforwardness and fairness. He was one of the few in the top leadership who was not afraid to tell Stalin the truth, reporting not only on successes but also on problems. For Stalin, Sergo was not just a people's commissar. He was his eyes and ears in industry. The leader trusted his assessments, his intuition, and his ability to find a way out of the most difficult situations. Ordzhonikidze's appointment to this post was a strategic move. Stalin put his most loyal and trusted comrade, whose devotion was beyond doubt, in a key position. In those years, their alliance seemed unbreakable. Sergo was the architect of Stalin's industrialization, the man who brought the leader's grandiose plans to life. It was the peak of his career, the peak of his influence, and, it seemed, the peak of their friendship. However, behind the facade of titanic construction projects and labor records lay another, darker reality. Industrialization was carried out using methods that today would be considered inhumane. It was built on the bones of dispossessed peasants and the forced labor of Gulag prisoners. Ordzhonikidze, being a pragmatist and a statesman to the core, saw this clearly. He was not a humanist in the modern sense of the word. He was a man of his era, convinced that the end justified the means. For him, the construction of Magnitogorsk or Uralmash was more important than the fates of thousands of nameless builders. But his pragmatism had a clear limit. He could not tolerate senseless cruelty and, most importantly, the destruction of valuable personnel. He gathered around him a whole galaxy of talented engineers and managers, the so-called Red Directors. These were people who had lived through the Civil War, fanatically devoted to their cause, but at the same time possessing enormous technical knowledge and organizational skills. Ordzhonikidze valued them not for their party experience, but for their business qualities. He personally promoted and defended people such as Ivan Likhachev, director of the ZIS automobile plant, Avram Zavanyagin, builder of the Norilsk Combine, and Boris Vanikov, future People's Commissar for Armaments. For them, he was not just a boss, but a master, a protector whose word could defend them against any denunciation. His office at the People's Commissariat for Heavy Industry on Nogina Square became for many the last resort where justice could be found. He was famous for his outbursts of anger, when he could tear a negligent manager to pieces, but just as quickly he would calm down and help correct mistakes. This tough but fair temperament earned him a reputation as a man who could be relied upon. It was precisely this trait of his, protecting his people, that became the first crack in his relationship with Stalin. The first ominous calls came in the late 1920s and early 1930s, during the Shakti case and the Prom Party trial. It was then that the thesis of sabotage by the old technical intelligentsia was first put forward. Ordzhonikidze, who was just taking over the management of industry, accepted this as a necessary measure to purge the apparatus of saboteurs. But as the wheel of repression spun faster and faster, he began to realize that it was not mythical spies who were being targeted, but the country's best engineers and managers, the very people on whom the entire industrialization process depended. He saw how absurd accusations were destroying entire industries, how the arrest of a single skilled specialist could paralyze the work of an entire factory. By 1934, after Kirov's assassination, the atmosphere in the country had become unbearable. An era began that would later be called the Great Terror. The NKVD, headed first by Yagoda and then by Yazhov, was given unlimited powers. Arrests came in waves, and one of the first waves swept over industry. For Yazhov and his apparatus, the saboteurs in the People's Commissariat for Heavy Industry were a gold mine. Any accident at work, any failure to meet a target could be blamed on a conspiracy. Ordzhonikidze found himself in a terrible situation. People he knew personally, whom he had promoted and defended, disappeared one after another into the basements of the Lubyanka. He began to resist desperately. He called Stalin, wrote him notes, demanded an investigation. At Politburo meetings, he engaged in open arguments with Yazhov, accusing the NKVD of fabricating cases. One of the most high-profile cases was that of his deputy, Georgy Yuri Pyatakov. Pyatakov was a brilliant organizer, one of the pillars of the People's Commissariat for Heavy Industry. When his name came up in one of the interrogations, Ordzhonikidze rushed to his defense. At one of the meetings, he publicly declared, addressing Stalin, "I vouch for Pyatakov as I would for myself." This was unheard of courage at the time. But Stalin had already made his decision. His response was cold and full of veiled threats. He advised Sergo not to meddle in matters that were none of his business, and to trust the authorities, who never made mistakes. This came as a shock to Ordzhonikidze. For the first time, he realized that his friendship and his many years of loyalty were no longer an argument for Stalin. He saw how the system he had helped to build was beginning to devour itself. He tried to save at least someone. When Lomov, the director of the Kemerovo chemical plant, was arrested, Ordzhonikidze secured his release by personally vouching for him. But these were isolated victories in a lost war. The NKVD acted with increasing audacity. And soon the blow was dealt to Sergo himself, to his most vulnerable spot. At the end of 1936, his older brother, Sergo Ordzhonikidze, was arrested. Sergo was an old Bolshevik, but a man far removed from high politics, working in the Transcaucasian Regional Committee of the party. There was no logic to his arrest except one: it was a direct and ruthless blow to Sergo. It was a signal: you are next, and no one will save you. Sergo was beside himself with rage and despair. He immediately called Stalin. Their last conversation, which Ordzhonikidze's wife later recounted, was terrifying. Sergo shouted into the phone, demanding an answer as to why his brother had been arrested. He accused Stalin of betrayal, of violating all the laws of comradeship. In response, he heard only icy calm. Stalin methodically listed the testimony extracted from other arrested persons, in which Sergo appeared as a participant in the conspiracy. The conversation ended with a phrase uttered by Stalin, which became a sentence for Sergo: "This is a matter for the authorities. They will sort it out." After that call, Ordzhonikidze realized that it was all over. His world collapsed. The man he considered a brother, whom he trusted unconditionally, had betrayed him in the most cynical way. He found himself completely isolated. His old comrades in the Politburo, Molotov, Kaganovich, Voroshilov, averted their eyes and avoided him. He became a toxic figure, communication with whom was deadly dangerous. There were mass arrests in his People's Commissariat, and he, the all-powerful People's Commissar, could do nothing. He was a general without an army, surrounded by enemies in his own headquarters. The last weeks of his life were agony. He was depressed, sleepless, and constantly smoking. He was preparing for the upcoming February-March plenum of the Central Committee in 1937, at which he was to deliver a report on sabotage in industry. Everyone understood that this speech would be fatal for him. He was faced with a choice: either to repent, admit the existence of thousands of enemies of the people in his industry, and thus betray everyone he had defended, or to openly challenge Stalin in the system, which was tantamount to suicide. On the evening of 17 February 1937, on the eve of his death, NKVD officers conducted a secret search of his Kremlin apartment. They were looking for compromising evidence, his archives, his correspondence. This was the last straw, a demonstration of complete humiliation. That same night, he had another difficult conversation with Stalin. What they talked about is not known for certain, but it seems that Stalin demanded his complete obedience and condemnation of his enemies at the plenum. On the morning of 18 February, Zinaida Gavrilovna, his wife, heard a shot in her husband's study. When she rushed in, Sergo Ordzhonikidze was already dead. He was lying on the floor near his desk with a revolver in his hand. He chose the third way: not to betray and not to be destroyed. He left on his own, dealing the system a final, desperate blow. His death became a silent accusation. The authorities' reaction was immediate and hypocritical. The official cause of death was announced as a heart attack. The country was not to know that one of the leader's closest associates, the Iron People's Commissar, had taken his own life. A lavish state funeral was organized. Newspapers came out with mournful headlines and obituaries signed by all members of the Politburo. The height of cynicism was that at the memorial service in Red Square, Stalin personally carried the urn with the ashes of the man he had effectively driven to his death. In his speech, he called Sergo an unbreakable Bolshevik and a loyal son of the party who had fallen in battle. It was a performance staged for the whole country, both chilling and instructive. But the system's revenge did not end there. After Sergo's death, repression fell upon his family. His wife, Zinaida Gavrilovna, was arrested and spent many years in camps. His surviving brothers were shot. All those around him, all those he had tried to save, were destroyed. The name Ordzhonikidze was erased from real history for many years, remaining only in the names of cities and factories, like an empty shell without content. Thus ended the story of Sergo Ordzhonikidze, a man who was one of the chief architects of Soviet industrial power. He was a product of his brutal era, tough, determined, and not always scrupulous in his methods. But he retained something that the system could not tolerate: personal loyalty, honor, and conscience. He sincerely believed in the cause he served and tried to protect it from the madness of terror. His tragedy is the tragedy of loyalty, which in a totalitarian regime turned out to be not a virtue but a mortal sin. He helped create a dragon that ultimately burned him too. And his suicidal shot in the Kremlin apartment sounded not only like an act of personal despair, but also like a dire warning that any system based on fear and lies inevitably begins to devour its own children. Their common homeland, Georgia, had a special impact on their relationship. A powerful Caucasian clan was forming in the upper echelons of power, which included Beria, Ordzhonikidze, and others in addition to them. They understood each other at a glance, often switched to their native language, and their communication retained a degree of informality that was unthinkable for Stalin's other associates. The leader often called him our Sergo, and this was not just a form of address, but a sign of belonging to the innermost circle. Their families were close. Zinaida Gavrilovna, Ordzhonikidze's wife, recalled how Stalin would casually drop in on them for dinner at their Kremlin apartment, and how affectionate he was with their adopted daughter Eteri. This idyllic picture stood in stark contrast to the chasm that had opened up between them in recent months. This closeness, this knowledge of each other without uniforms, made the subsequent betrayal even more monstrous and incomprehensible to Ordzhonikidze. He could not believe that Koba, with whom they had shared a piece of frozen bread in exile, was capable of such cold, calculated cruelty. In his work as People's Commissar, Ordzhonikidze was not simply a blind executor of Stalin's will. He was a pragmatist who often engaged in fierce debates about the methods of industrialization. His clashes with the People's Commissariat of Finance, which demanded more moderate growth rates, pointing to a lack of resources, are legendary. Sergo, banging his fist on the table, argued that time was running out, that the country was surrounded by enemies, and that industrial progress was a matter of survival. At the same time, he was categorically opposed to paper records and window dressing. He demanded real, not inflated indicators, and could give any director a dressing down for attempting to embellish reality. He understood that factories are not built with slogans, but with the hands of specific specialists. That is why he so fiercely defended the bourgeois specialists, engineers of the old pre-revolutionary school. He saw them not as class enemies, but as bearers of invaluable knowledge, without which it was impossible to start up a single complex machine. He pulled them out of prison, gave them responsible positions, and protected them from attacks by party orthodoxy, risking his own reputation. Ordzhonikidze's reception room turned into a kind of resistance headquarters. The wives of arrested engineers and factory directors whose best workers had been taken away at night flocked there. Sergo listened to everyone. At first, his phone calls to the NKVD carried weight. Sometimes he managed to snatch a person from Yezhov's clutches. But gradually, he began to notice that on the other end of the line, people were increasingly responding evasively or simply not picking up the phone. His influence was evaporating before his eyes. He was a member of the Politburo, one of the leaders of the party, but his orders were being sabotaged by a department that was formally under the control of the same party. It was absurd and frightening. He saw how his comrades, the same Molotov or Kaganovich with whom he had worked side by side for decades, began to shun him. In the corridors of the Kremlin, conversations fell silent when he appeared, and people lowered their eyes. He found himself in a vacuum, surrounded by silent condemnation and fear. The atmosphere around him was becoming physically oppressive. His flat in the Kremlin, once a place for friendly gatherings, had turned into a prison. He knew that his phones were being tapped and that his every move was being monitored. His neighbors in the Kremlin building were NKVD officers, and there was no doubt that their ears were pressed against the walls. He became withdrawn, almost stopped talking to his wife, afraid of harming her with a careless word. He spent sleepless nights in his study, writing reams of Kazbek cigarettes. He sorted through old photographs and letters, trying to understand at what point everything had gone wrong, where the point of no return had been, after which friendship and common struggle had turned into a bloody farce. His powerful health, tempered by the revolution and civil war, began to fail. He became gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He was no longer the formidable Iron People's Commissar, but an exhausted man driven into a corner. The pressure reached its peak on the eve of the February-March plenum of the Central Committee in 1937. This plenum was to become the ideological platform for the launch of the Great Terror. It was planned to finally confirm the thesis of total sabotage and the need for a merciless struggle against the enemies of the people. Ordzhonikidze, as People's Commissar of Heavy Industry, was to deliver one of the key reports. He was expected not only to report on his work, but also to make a public confession. He was supposed to admit that he had overlooked entire nests of spies and saboteurs in his department, name names, and condemn those he had defended only yesterday. In essence, he was asked to publicly renounce himself, his convictions, and his people. This would not have been a mere political maneuver, but an act of moral suicide. He understood that any word he uttered would be used against him. If he named names, he would become an accomplice to the crime. If he refused, he himself would immediately be declared an accomplice of the enemies. There was no way out. Stalin's trap had snapped shut. Immediately after the body was discovered, members of the Politburo, Molotov, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, as well as the leadership of the NKVD arrived at his apartment. The picture was clear, but the decision was made instantly, to hide the truth. While doctors were drawing up a false conclusion about heart paralysis, state security officers conducted a thorough search. They seized Sergo's entire personal archive, his diaries, correspondence with Stalin, notebooks, everything that could shed light on the true causes of the tragedy. Zinaida Gavrilovna, who was in a state of shock, was forced to sign the official version. She later recalled how one of the guards hastily plastered over the bullet hole in the wall behind the sofa. The performance had to be flawless. The system not only killed him, but also stole his death, replacing his desperate protest with a banal medical diagnosis. Why did Stalin, known for his vindictiveness but also his pragmatism, go so far as to destroy his most effective and loyal comrade? The reason was deeper than simple irritation at his stubbornness. By 1937, Stalin had built a regime of absolute personal power, and in this structure there was no place for figures with their own authority. Ordzhonikidze was just such a figure. He was popular in the party and among the people, and was respected as the creator of Soviet industry. He was one of the last old Bolsheviks in Stalin's entourage who still remembered him as Koba, an equal among equals. His independence, his straightforwardness, his very personality became a threat. He was a living reproach, a reminder that it was possible to serve the cause without becoming a docile slave. By destroying Ordzhonikidze, Stalin achieved several goals. He eliminated a potential center of opposition, intimidated the other members of the Politburo by showing that no one was untouchable, and gained complete control over industry, which could now be cleaned up without any interference. Sergo's death was not a tragic accident, but a cold, calculated political assassination disguised as suicide, which in turn was disguised as a heart attack. It was a Matryoshka doll of lies, at the center of which lay the tragedy of a man whose loyalty proved incompatible with the era in which he lived. His famous spinner, the Kremlin telephone, never stopped ringing. Calls went directly to factories, design bureaus, and giant construction sites. He could wake up the director of Magnitogorsk at 3 in the morning to demand an explanation for the delay in metal deliveries, and 5 minutes later call the People's Commissariat of Transport to reprimand them for not delivering the carriages on time. It was manual control at its finest, but it worked. The system he had created was based on his personal authority and energy. And when that authority collided with the faceless machine of the NKVD, the system began to fail. He tried to fight terror with his own systemic methods. At Politburo meetings, he demanded that limits be set on the arrests of engineers, arguing to Molotov and Kaganovich that without these personnel, industry would simply grind to a halt. He appealed not to humanism, but to state expediency, to figures and facts. But he did not understand, or did not want to understand, that the logic of terror was different. He needed factories, while Stalin needed absolute power built on fear, and these two goals became mutually exclusive. For him, Stalin's betrayal was not just a political disagreement. It was a deeply personal, almost existential blow. He saw Stalin not only as a leader, but also as Koba, a comrade in exile, a man whose shortcomings he knew, but whose ultimate devotion to the common cause he did not doubt. And suddenly it turned out that this Koba was methodically destroying the very cause to which they had both devoted their lives. It was akin to an architect who had built a building being handed a sledgehammer and ordered to demolish the load-bearing walls. For Ordzhonikidze, every engineer who was arrested was like a collapsed arch. He could not understand this new, irrational cruelty, where loyalty and professionalism were no longer a defense, but on the contrary, could become a cause of death. The story of Ivan Likachev, director of the ZIS automobile factory and one of Sergo's favorites, is telling. When clouds gathered over Likachev and Yezhov was already preparing an arrest warrant for him, Ordzhonikidze went on the offensive. At a meeting in the Kremlin, in the presence of Stalin, he fiercely defended his director. Stalin, listening to his tirade, said with an icy smile, "All right, Sergo, since you vouch for him so much, maybe we should arrest you instead of him." A dead silence fell over the room. Everyone understood that this was no joke, but the final straw. Ordzhonikidze turned pale, but held his gaze. He defended Likachev that time, but the price of this victory was enormous. He showed Stalin that his personal loyalty to people was more important to him than fear. And in the coordinate system of 1937, this was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. In his last days, he worked feverishly on his report for the plenum. There is evidence that he had no intention of repenting. On the contrary, he was preparing a speech in which, based on facts, he intended to prove the destructiveness of mass repression for the country's industry. He wanted to turn the plenum podium into his last battle, appealing to the common sense of the party leaders. It was a desperate and naive attempt to stop the steamroller that he himself had helped to set in motion. Until the very end, he believed that the truth, backed up by figures, could change something. The shot in his office was an admission that words no longer had any meaning. It was his only remaining argument in the dispute with madness, silent and deafening. It is telling that even after Sergo's death, his ghost continued to haunt the system. In the camp barracks and during interrogations by the NKVD, the name Ordzhonikidze became a kind of password, a symbol of resistance. "I am Sergo's man." This phrase, uttered by an arrested engineer, could either save or destroy him, depending on the investigator. For some, it was a mark of quality. For others, a direct indication of belonging to the Ordzhonikidze conspiracy. His death did not stop the terror. On the contrary, it gave the executioners free rein, removing the last influential defender. The fate of his legacy is also interesting. The factories built under his leadership, Uralmash, Zaporozhstal, and Chelyabinsk tractor plant, became the backbone of the Soviet defense industry during the Great Patriotic War. This resulted in a terrible paradox. The country survived and won thanks to the industrial power created by a man whom the same country, in the person of its leader, destroyed as an enemy. The weapons of victory were forged on machines installed by saboteurs and spies whom Sergo tried in vain to protect. This became the most compelling, albeit posthumous, proof of his rightness. The story of Sergo Ordzhonikidze is not just a tale of friendship and betrayal, but a profound drama that reminds us of the fragility of human relationships under totalitarian rule. His loyalty cost him his life, leaving behind questions about the price of principles in an era of terror.